any discussion regarding the meeting minutes in front of us? Hearing none, would somebody like to make a motion to accept the minutes as they are written?
I make a motion to accept the minutes as written.
Would somebody like to second that?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor? Aye. Aye. All
Aye.
opposed? I heard that it is unanimous. The meeting minutes are accepted as written. On to our next agenda item is our fiscal year 2019 audit, and we have with us today Karen Carew to go over the audit results with us. Just so everyone knows, the audit committee has already reviewed these results and are in agreement with the audit results. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Karen.
I met most of you before. For those of you who aren't familiar with me, Karen Carew, Wells, and we are your auditors. We come in annually to perform the audit. These have already been reviewed by the audit committee, and so in the interest of time, what I want to make sure that I do is address any questions you may have, and only hit the highlights in terms of some of the changes that happened in the financial statements. Does that sound okay? Great. We'll start with some of the easier things. There's two letters that would have been circulated along with the financial statements. You may find them either in front of or behind the pages marked draft. There's another governance letter in there.
I'm sure it is.
Okay.
That is,
Sorry, we're out of
Actually,
order
yeah.
for you guys.
we don't have that one.
We did not put that in the packet.
Oh, sorry.
It was,
I did not bring extra copies, but what I will
That's
do is
okay.
I'll circulate them to you.
Great.
Okay? So I will forward them along to Aaron or somebody, and we will get those along. There are two letters.
Excuse me, Patrick, do I need to disclose for the record that I'm videotaping the meeting?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yes,
Thank
I just wanted to disclose
Thank
that,
you,
thank
Laura.
you. Thank you, appreciate that.
Okay, so there are two letters that you will see come around. The first is the required communication that an auditor has with governance, just to let you know how the audit went. There was no opinion shopping, meaning there was no questions in terms of what the presentation or particular accounting principles were, that we are aware that were consulted with other outside auditors. There were no disagreements with management in terms of the presentation, everything that was in here. Everybody on the team was incredibly helpful. It went very smoothly and at Helms. And there were no problems obtaining the information we were looking for or responding to any of the requests that we issued. This letter will also mention just things that may.
Pamela Jewell, Howden. Join the meeting.
The governance letter will also just mention a couple of the estimates that are considered more sensitive to users. Again, that's in quotes, right? Everybody has different levels. The two that we talk about are the estimate of the vaccine expense, which is based on projected and requested remittances by the state of New Hampshire. And of course, the estimate of the balance due in collectibles and receivables is on the assumption that those will be received or, will not be received. Those are the only two estimates that are used in preparing these financial statements, and so we just draw your attention to those. We looked at the key factors, we agree with the key factors, and I think they're reasonably stated. Okay. Make sure I didn't miss anything else on there. We did request a representation letter from management. The letter essentially says to us as the auditors from Helms that yes, they have disclosed everything we should be aware of in putting together and giving an opinion on these financial statements.
Marissa Trexler. Join the meeting.
The other letter is a recommendation on internal controls. I want to start with the internal controls that are in place are in great shape. It is not uncommon for us to look at things, especially in the transition year, and say, how's this working, how's this not working? Is there anything that you'd like to see changed? Is there anything we think could be done to strengthen these controls? We did put some recommendations out there in terms of those. Again, Helms was very, very responsive. They've already addressed everything on there and brought it to the attention of the audit committee. Okay? So I'm going to spend a lot of time on there unless somebody has a specific question. When you receive the letter, since it's after the fact, if you do have a question, please feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm always available. Okay. Now to the big pages stamped draft that everybody has. everything in the financial statements is going to look very familiar to those who have seen them in the past. There were not a lot of significant changes, but there were some changes in terms of the presentation of what's considered restricted or unrestricted net assets. This was a new accounting principle that has come out and was issued and required to be implemented, and so it was done. Draw your attention to page 3 of the financial statements. This is the statement of that position. The financial position, excuse me. At the bottom of the page, you'll see it says net assets without donor restrictions and net assets with donor restrictions. In the past, that would have said unrestricted or temporarily restricted, okay? Really just a wording thing. None of the changes in implementing the new net asset rules changed how things were actually categorized when it came to restrictions, okay? As part of that, they also required a couple of new note disclosures. And so we will move beyond and go to page, oops. Should have put a flip on the page 9. In addition to the change to the net asset presentation and those disclosures, it also required nonprofits to take a look at what their current resources are and what is available to meet general operating expenses in the next year. Really, it's trying to look at the liquidity and the financial stability of nonprofit organizations and give them an opportunity to express to the users of the financial statements what that picture looks like. This is a new note. You have cash, you have short-term equivalents. It also talks about how that liquidity is managed to meet upcoming needs. And in particular, we have made sure to describe that the current resources are there for general expenditures, including the required remittance to the state that's coming. And also we've talked about it being at a level to ensure sufficient reserves that the vaccination rate charged each year can be stabilized and not experience such increases and decreases as it has in the past. Are there any other questions? Does anybody have questions on the numbers specifically? Anything that you want me to talk to? This is a little different than I normally do because I've already met with the audit committee, so I did do an accounting 101 with these.
Does anyone have questions regarding the financial statements? Okay, hearing.
This is Lorraine Raddick. I have a question on page 3. I noticed there's a marked increase in assets for 2019 versus 2018. It has like almost 4,000, now we're up to 12,500. Is there a particular reason why the assets are so much greater this year?
Absolutely. I'm gonna ask you to flip the page to page 4. And you'll see that this year, about halfway down, net assets with donor restrictions, you had the assessment income, okay, that was a little bit less, but significantly lower than that income was a little further down. The remittance to the state of New Hampshire was 9.2 instead of 18 million. This again gets to why we're trying to express in the financial statements and why the board is working to stabilize those rates to the insurers.
And we also have the TRICARE settlement. in
Yes.
terms of,
That was another
additional-
$4 million.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Hearing none, would somebody like to make a motion that we accept these financial statements as they are published?
I'll motion.
Thank you. Would somebody like to second that motion?
I'll second it.
I'll second.
Okay, thank you. All in favor? Aye.
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 All opposed? I heard that is unanimous. The financial statements are accepted as they are presented to us here today.
Before I head out, do you need me for any type of executive session or questions? I've already done it with the audit committee.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think we're good.
Thank you,
very
Karen. We
much for your
appreciate you
time.
coming
Take
in
care,
this
have a good
morning.
meeting.
Thank you.
you.
Have a great day. Okay, we are now on to,
The assessment
the
process.
assessment process.
Great. So in your packet, if you turn to page 22, there's page numbers in the bottom in red. what we're going to do right now is to review the 2020 rate setting process. This was also reviewed last week with the audit committee with a recommendation to bring it to the board today. In terms of contents, we'll just give a little bit of background, some historical trends. We'll talk about the rate assumptions that we used and the assessment rates themselves that are proposed. There's also information in the back of the packet which contains the Department of Health and Human Services spreadsheets that we receive each year to help set the rates, and then the administrative budget that was agreed to by the board, or approved by the board at the June meeting. So if you turn to page 25, this really just talks about the timeline. So in terms of what we've done over the summer, so we started the data collection and the modeling back in July. In August, we had initial data from DHHS that we started to plug into it. We met with the audit committee as well to really start talking a little bit before the September audit committee about what we were thinking in terms of assumptions moving forward, and had additional feedback from the committee. And then we received towards the end of August the modeling data that we used from DHHS. It was approved by the recommendation of the audit committee in September, and here we are today. We'll notify carriers by the end of the month, and in October, we'll talk about this in a minute, the CDC credit will be known. In terms of page 26, the goals this year were really to continue to try to simplify the prior assessment process. As Karen mentioned, really trying to work to keep the assessment level in the future years, and also to make sure on bullet 3 that we're aligned with the RSA and the operations manual. We also talked about reducing financial risk and exposure to the organization, including the creation of a $5 million reserve fund, which we'll also ask for a vote on today, as it's tied to the assessment. And the TRICARE claim resolution came to a close, and then we're now in an ongoing assessment period with Humana and with Margaret's Point. There were incurred some one-time allowances for unbudgeted FY19 administrative expenses. They really were tied to two things. There was the run out of the prior administrator and the startup costs, and then also the WVA costs that were spent in terms of trying to bring the TRICARE, or actually bringing the TRICARE to a close. So that's really sort of where we were since last September in terms of items that impact the assessment. Page 27 just details out really more for historical record keeping, sort of some of the things that happened in fiscal year 19. We were able to increase investment income. We had the one-time TRICARE arrearage. We've begun to collect quarterly additional funds. And then Tufts Health Plan, if folks remember, actually had several products they weren't reporting on, and so we were able to go back for 3 years and make those collections, and then we also had an interest charge for them. And then on the expense side, the WVA expense I mentioned a minute ago, there was also a final contribution to WVA. EBPA, which is a TPA, third-party administrator, received a refund, and we wrote off in June the Minuteman receivable. Page 28, it's not meant for an eye test, but this is really a record that we're keeping moving forward. There's the fiscal year for the state, there's a fiscal year for the feds, there's the calendar year, and really just trying to keep track of the assessments and the rates, as well as what we collect in the CDC. So this is really, again, more for historical record keeping going forward. Several of the slides, the next few slides we'll go through. Page 9, this continued, we showed this last year, and it continues to show that there is a decreasing trend that you'll see in orange of the lives in total. If we look at the absolute percentage between Q2 of 2014 and Q1 of 2019, it's about a 1.6% drop, and that's pretty consistent with last year. We also looked at a rolling percentage change from year to year, and it was also a drop of 0.1%, so a little bit lower. And then the blue is just the rate history, so you can sort of see the jump and then the decline again. Slide 31 This is really looking at the total state vaccine expenditure and then also the carrier percentage amount. And you'll see an increase in curve line for the total expenditure requests. And then in terms of the trend line for the carrier percentage, it's been pretty level. The 13-year trend is a little bit under 60%, and then the 13-year trend for the expenditures is about 24 million. Page 32, and we'll talk about this more with our investment management team in a few minutes. This is really just a quick chart to show you the investment interest income and the increase that we've been able to provide based upon our work with folks at Bank of New Hampshire. And this also figures into our budget planning moving forward. So any questions on the rates, the historical trends from the board? Many folks have seen this already through the audit committee. Okay, so page 3, this talks about sort of the rate setting moving forward. 13, excuse me. These were the assumptions that we made going into the audit committee meeting last week with 1 or 2 minor adjustments based upon feedback. Number 1 is really the key thing that we're trying to do here is to try to keep the rates level. We talked last year about sort of a $6.50 to $8 range. We also talked about recovering for 2 years in a row NHVA funds that were sitting with the Department of Health and Human Services. And to Lorraine's question earlier, part of what we did this year was to pay less to the state in order to be able to start to draw those funds down. And then the model that we'll talk about in a minute is designed to retrieve, if you will, the rest of those funds. The assessed lives, we assumed the 0.1% decline, and that we'd assume that that will continue based upon historical trends. Based upon the RSA 126, there will be a reserve 10% that's taken of the total non-federal program costs for the prior year, or succeeding year, excuse me. The TRICARE cap rate, I have a quick update on that. Right now it's at $12.47, and we are expecting that there'll be a rate change from TRICARE going into next year. We're expecting to have that rate change by the end of this month, and we've also been told that will probably increase slightly. And that does, what that does for us, sort of a net effect, is it allows us to recoup dollars faster from TRICARE as we recoup the remaining $1.3 million from them. At the current rate, it'll take about 16 quarters to receive that, total 1.49 million. And again, we're hoping that we can start to receive that faster with a higher TRICARE rate. Because New Hampshire has one of the highest immunization rates in the country, there's sort of a reward for that in the TRICARE formula. In terms of number 6, we looked at the initial estimates for calendar year 2020 and the percentage paid by the carriers at 64%. We are going to use in the model a 59.7% for the outer years, the next 3 years, based upon historical trends. We talked before about not receiving the outstanding Minuteman receivable, and that was reserved as 6/30/19, excuse me. The CDC annual credit will be on October 1st. We're expecting it to be no more than last year's, and we've assumed 1.9 million in the model. If this increases, then from a conservative perspective in the model, will actually be a little bit higher in terms of cash at the end of the year. Number 9 states really picking up on last year's discussion about reserving the $5 million as of October 1st, and then any excess cash beyond the $5 million will be used for rate stabilization. Right now, that excess cash primarily comes from the TOS recoupment as well as TRICARE. We made no assumptions for late payment interest assessments. We've only had one carrier since we started that's actually been late, and so in dollars we're pretty small. And we also made no assumption for the reimbursement of New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services request for a portion of their total administrative costs. And then in terms of interest rate assumptions, I think we went pretty conservatively that we will see a decrease based in terms of what the Fed has done in terms of trying to push rates lower, from 2% today to about 1% next year. And again, so these 12 items are really the core assumptions that we used going into the process. Any questions about any of the assumptions or?
Patrick, I just wanted to update you that as of yesterday, the value of the state purchased vaccine at McKesson is $2.8 million.
Okay.
Although we have orders to be processed and we'll be processing orders throughout the week, so that value will go down.
Okay.
And we'll know obviously on Monday what the credit will be, so.
Okay.
But I don't have any necessarily concerns with the 1.9 million
Okay.
going to the model, because as you point out, it's conservative and will result in a surplus again.
Okay, great.
Depending on what that difference ends up being, but it's gonna be less than $1 million.
Okay.
Because right now it's 2.8.
2.8 million, okay, great, thank you. Yeah, we can plug that into next year's model as soon as you get the number. Okay, thank you. So any other comments or questions about assumptions? Okay. So if you turn to page 14, the next slide, the cash flow and the reconciliation and the rate setting. What you'll see here in terms of columns, the first one is just a description of the items that we'll see in the rows going across. What you'll see under new model, that first column shows the actuals for last year, and again, the rate that was set at 670. And then you'll see under the new model, the next one, the proposed rate moving forward. And in terms of adjustment factors, we had an increase last year of from 26.8 to 28.8 projected for this coming year in terms of the total ask from the state. And as we mentioned a few minutes ago, we did use the 64.04% for this current upcoming year. And you'll see to the right of that in red 59.7, and that's really just what we've trended historically. In terms of payment before offsetting DHHS surplus, 18.47 million, and then we have the administrative expenses, and they're less this year, and they don't include any one-time costs as we have in the prior year. And then if we go down to where it says 10% in red, that's the reserve per RSA 126, and then we get to the total of 20.2 million in terms of the assessment to be raised before the offset. And then we less the Q1 assessments collected in May, almost $4 million, and then you'll see an estimate of lives, which is 0.1% less than the prior year. And then you'll see in terms of the rate from 670, and we collected in Q4 647. In terms of end of year cash balance, we had beginning balance of 12.2 million. We expect with the receivables 13.4, and then projected interest, again, less than the prior year's interest based upon declining rates, and so total receipts of 13.6 million. So when you project the gross vaccine costs after deducting VFC and New Hampshire credits, it's 15.5 million minus the carry forward from the prior year, and so the net payment to DHHS that we're recommending is $11.7 million. Dr. Edwards.
Sorry, I was totally lost.
Oh no, sorry about that. And so, John, do you have anything else you want to say about that?
No, you're good.
Okay. You want to talk about the rates? Let's move forward.
Well, we're at 647, we're moving to 680, and then 695, and then $7. So, and if you look at the very bottom line, you can see our total cash. We started this year at 12.2 million. We expect to end up at 14 million. Again, principally because we're paying less than the total amount because we're using some of the credits available from the state. And And then that 14 million drops to 11 million, I'm reading right on the bottom line, then 10 million 8, then 10 million, and then 8 million 7. And part of the objective was to make sure that the first quarter, which is collected in May, is covered, because that's gonna be used in the next year. So if you take that number out of these total cash numbers, you end up with the reserve and excess cash dropping from 10 million down finally to 5 million, which is the reserve that is our target. So we're taking 4 years to get to the $5 million.
So it's the bottom, excuse me, the bottom yellow line there. And so again, trying to hold the rate as steady as possible, we still have net of 5 million in cash at the end, and again, that's the reserve. So any questions about what's shown here? The audit committee did review this last week and move the new rate forward to $6.80.
Patrick, I have a question.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, because I asked this when we met last week, and
Sure.
now I can't remember the answer, but the carry forward of DHHS unspent funds in the new model column where it shows 3.7 million.
Right.
Where is that number coming from again? Because it does not match the actual surplus
Sure.
amount that we gave.
If you turn to page 18, and John, is your computer?
Yeah, this is very small print numbers. This is the report that Beth provides to us. Historically, we do have, in the green column, we have the actual results that she's reported. You can see those on the prior page. And then we've taken the numbers that she's projected for the future. And you can see the difference, the 6,722,000 is the carry forward amount that is in this report. And we actually are only gonna use the 3,000,007 number that she's referring to in the other page. And the reason is that we're trying to get this carry forward down to 0. Which is kind of the goal. At that point, we'll have no more credits coming. So, because we're looking out into the future, next year's projected cost is 18,473,000 compared to the 15,491,000 that is this year. I'm looking on line 7. So that's the net cost that Vaccine Association will pay after deductions for the VFC and state government money, the 274 and 10,371,000. So basically, we added 2,981,494 to the payment to bring the balance to 0. And that 2,981,000 reduces the 6,722,000 down to the 3,007,000. It's a little complicated. If you look at these very small print notes, the one on the bottom right shows the 15,574,000 from last year, deducting 6.7 carry forward brings us to 8,007,000. And then we're deducting, and that's the 2,981,000 expected underpayment. So that's the amount that we're actually adding to the credit that we're taking.
So it's like a projection of next year's, because we're actually calculating the assessment for a year ahead.
Right, because it all.
I think it's okay, because what I would have envisioned doing is taking the 18 million that we've projected as being the state share and subtracting the 6.7 million surplus, which would put you down in the same ballpark as your 11.7 million remittance anyway, so it gets you to the same
number. Okay.
number-ish anyway, so.
So we
I
could think
it's
about.
fine. It just is not the
displaying it.
numbers I was expecting to see, cause I didn't know where it came from, but
Okay.
we've done some math to project the future surplus. So it seems reasonable,
You okay with this?
yes, yeah.
And then the only other things that you'll see in the packet, we don't have to go over them though, are the spreadsheets we received from DHHS and then the budget that was approved administratively back in June. Any questions? Comments?
Are folks comfortable with the presentation as we've seen it and the numbers as we've seen them? We wanna take this into two votes and first
think we
vote
do.
on so I think first what we wanna do is, take a vote on the establishment of the $5 million reserve. That's something that we've discussed as both an audit committee and a board. And the purpose of having that reserve would be in the event that, you need a cushion, or there's a market increase in expense, or there's a one-time, assessment that's made, to the Vaccine Association. This way we wouldn't have to necessarily go back to the carriers for additional money. And also it helps us with that cash flow and keeping that assessment rate somewhat stable year over year. So at this point, unless there's further discussion on the $5 million reserve, I'll entertain a motion to establish the $5 million reserve as it's been presented to us here.
I'll make the motion.
Okay, would somebody like to second that motion?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, I heard that as unanimous. The next vote that we will take is regarding our assessment rate for the upcoming year of $6.80. Is there any further discussion regarding that assessment rate? Hearing none, would somebody like to make a motion that we accept the $6.80 as our upcoming assessment rate?
I'll make it.
Would somebody like to second that motion?
Second.
All in favor of $6.80 as our assessment rate? Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? I heard that as unanimous as well, so we are set at $6.80. Patrick, I think we also had,
Financials.
review of financial statements.
So if you turn your packet to page 44, the red page numbers in the bottom right. We'll just briefly go through this. I'll say, just a sort of introduction, that this is really reporting the first 2 months of the quarter, so we don't have the full quarter. That won't be completed until the end of September, but we'll have the first quarter results at the next board meeting in November. So in terms of where we are budget-wise, we're tracking pretty well at this point. The total amounts in terms of actual assessment collections was $3.2 million. We had budgeted about $3.4 million, so we're off about $214,000 at this point. We had not previously budgeted for the TRICARE settlement dollars, but we've received $81,882 so far in the 2 months of the quarter. We'll also see the interest income. We budgeted $22,500 and the actuals at $45,000, so again up $22,500. And I think once we do more work with the Bank of New Hampshire, we can look at potentially re-looking at that budgeted number. And then, so if you look total, it's about $109,922 above budget. There's really nothing else on this particular page. You will see on the bottom 2 lines, we're just tracking the cash balance at the beginning and also the end. That's something we've added. In terms of the statement of financial position, you will see between June 30th and August 31st an increase from $12.2 million to $15.5 total in terms of current assets, and that's again the assessments that were received in the past 2 months. And then I guess the only other comment I'd make down under liquidity reserve, that $250,000 is the existing reserve fund that the board has. Otherwise, I don't really have 2 months of data here. And then on the last page, 46, this is the statement change in net assets. Again, you'll see the investment income delta, you'll see the TRICARE receipts, and then the total income about 109,000 off from budget. And then in terms of the other expenses at this point, it's really just the bank service charges, management fees are on track, it's a fixed amount every month. Some legal fees again, and then professional fees for the audit. And again, primarily due to the assessment being down, the 214, we're at $110,000 over budget for just the 2 months. I expect that to come back into alignment after the third month is collected. And then the other thing you'll see in the lower left-hand corner will just be tracking moving forward quarter by quarter, the projected lives, the actual lives, the variance, and the assessment rate, and also for the TRICARE portion, so we can see for the additional funds from Humana and from Martin's Point, what the rate is for that. So that's really it in terms of the current financials, unless there's any questions. I don't think we need a vote on that. In terms of assessment update, Erin, we had the one late payment.
Yes.
So the first one we've had, actually.
And we still haven't received payment for quarter two. It's only just over $1,000. We anticipate interest will be about $50.
So they filed early, but just didn't make the payment.
Yeah.
And are they aware?
Oh, yes,
Oh, yes.
I've been in constant contact.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Phone, email.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's really it in terms of our updates with the executive director.
Okay, at this point now, we're into our governance documents. We have the late payment interest policy revision, which is on
Page 47.
47 of the packet.
So I can walk us through
That would be awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
So there's a memorandum dated August 6th, and this was sent to the audit committee for review. And really this had to do with part of the exit meeting that we had with Karen Carew and Wells, and they were looking at whether or not, really sort of how the interest had been charged, late interest to Tufts Health Plan. And what we really realized is that there were some sort of fundamental, also called them misunderstandings about how the policy would be interpreted, given the way that it was written. And so you'll see 4 bullet points that we were trying to address in terms of revising the policy moving forward. And as of the time of the memo, we hadn't had any late payments, and so we thought that we should clarify the policy in case there were any moving forward. We also wanted to try to align the policy with New Hampshire Health Plan, which is another assessment process, because we're working with primarily the same carriers, definitely on the fully insured side. And again, just trying to create consistency for the carriers. And then in terms of moving the policy forward, we were proposing a January 1st start date, again, just so it's lined up with the calendar year. The current 2-week grace period really has created some confusion. Is it 10 business days? Is it 14 calendar days, or vice versa? So we want to address that directly. And then we also wanted to address in terms of the electronic funds transfer deposit dates and the check postmark dates, using postmark, which is new, as the dates from which to calculate the interest moving forward. And then we also looked at potentially terminating the current lockbox vendor contract, because there's pretty low administrative burden if we reduced it. We would reduce funds, expenses of almost $2,800 per year. And this would give us the ability to track the postmark date as assessment checks are received. And so the next page really talks about, well, is the actual proposed policy. And we don't have this redlined. It is redlined in audit committee minutes, and primarily here just because of the number of changes that are presented. So the first section of it really just states what's required by the RSA in terms of the 45 days at the end of each quarter that folks have to submit their assessments, and then the dates. And then we really broke out into two different practices, because this is what we're seeing happening operationally, how the assessment late payment interest policy would work. So the first one is if they file it on time, but it's a late payment. So an example, the one that Erin just mentioned, they filed it on time, but the payment itself is late. And so we're using a plan of operation, the number of days late by the calculation of dollars, and then that basically creates the amount due, and then an invoice is sent to the entity that's being assessed. And then either again, we'll look at the date of the EFT payment that was received electronically, or we'll look at the postmarked date for the payments received via bank check. And then in the other scenario that happens is they can actually file late, and they can also have a late payment. And again, this is really if they file after 45 days after the end of each quarter, and interest at that point will be calculated between the due date and the filing date, and we'll invoice them from our system. And then once we receive the payment, again, we'll look at the difference between the filing date and the payment received date, and again, whether it's EFT or we're looking at checks and the postmark. And then similar to the prior policy, if the interest amount due is under $10, we will not be collecting that. So with the exception of one typo that I found under the first paragraph, file on time late payment, that says postmark data, it should say postmark date. And that's really the changes. And again, the audit committee had a chance to review this and voted to push it forward for approval by the board.
Is there any discussion regarding this policy? Hearing none, would somebody like to make a motion that we accept this policy as it's published? Thank you. Would somebody like to second that motion?
I'll second.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
All in favor of adopting this policy as it's written with that one correction of date instead of data? All in favor, aye?
Aye.
All opposed?
Aye.
I heard that as unanimous. Thank you. And now we are on to our investment policy revisions, which is found on page
49. So you'll see both a clean copy in here, which is pages 49 through 52, and then you'll see a heavily edited red line copy, pages 53 through 60 of the packet. And we had an opportunity, again, in the audit committee last month, and actually the prior one, to really talk about potential changes to the investment policy, really looking at refining the objectives and principles of the policy, and then in addition to refining the investment guidelines and breaking that out into short-term versus longer-term investments. And there's many other changes, but at this point I'd like to turn it over to our representatives from Bank of New Hampshire, and they can walk us through this in more detail. And so we have Donna Murray on the end there, and Arlene Folsom closer to me.
Thank you, Patrick, and we're happy to be here again, and we're thrilled to have been to the audit committee, been able to discuss the detail, the very detailed changes that Donna has been working on for several months now. It was great dialogue between the audit committee and Patrick and the bank, particularly with Donna, so I'll turn it over to her for the latest, but I think we're in a really good place for the short-term and long-term components.
So thank you again for having us here. Just a little brief background, which the audit committee, we've come in a few months ago and done a presentation to the audit committee, so we could kind of go over our relationship. We've been working with New Hampshire Vaccine since 2005. Primarily we had been investing the assets for that short-term money. There was some longer-term money as interest had accrued and things like that we were also investing for slightly longer time periods. But generally speaking, it was really for the collection money that was to be paid out to the state on June 30th. For a little while, I guess, the previous person or the previous group in charge had decided to keep that money in an insured cash sweep account. And that's basically, it is insured money. It's general purposes for institutions like municipalities that have tax monies flow in. There's a very short time period during budget season, and then the tax money flows out. So maybe several months. It's not really meant to be a long-term investment vehicle. But the rates, were very, very low during this time period, and and the money was just sort of accumulating there. And then when Helms came in the summer and fall of 2018 and requested a couple increases in that, that was fine. We've always had a great relationship, again, with Helms and with New Hampshire Vaccine. The whole purpose, though, again, to hopefully bring this money back over to be invested, foremost at higher rates for Vaccine Association, and also to get it out of the insured cash sweep. That is not money that the bank can actually use. That money comes out of our pocket, so all of the interest paid was actually interest paid by the bank, because we can't use that money to loan out to other institutions and make sort of a premium on. So for that purpose, in speaking with Helms, we let them know that we were gonna have to kind of bring that money back down, or the rate back down, and sort of hopefully get the money back to being invested appropriately and earning a higher overall rate for the Vaccine Association. So for the policy, really the policy, you might, for those that were here in 2016, we had moved over, it was the Washington state policy. We worked with Kids Vax on that, and that policy was really kind of meant more, it seemed, for sort of longer term money meshed in with the shorter term money. And one of the primary things that I noticed as an investment professional is that there are really two types of money that we're talking about here. The very, very short term money, which is, what I call the vaccine money. And that really, there is no, that the preservation of principal and high liquidity are the two primary principles driving the investment behind that money. There is no possibility for loss. So we wanted to really make that apparent in the investment policy. So we created a very short term, if you go to, we'll go ahead and use the red line copy on page 53. Is sort of, there isn't too much change here, just adding in an area that we are not using equities at this time for any long-term assets. If at a future date is something that can be discussed. A lot of the redaction here, or not redaction, but the crossed out portion was just we made an investment area for those short-term money, the long-term money, and then we took all of this advisory language and we put it all at the end. So it was, kind of combined into one area there. So we have in the middle of page 54, the very short-term investments. All investments need to mature by June 15th. And then it goes into the eligible short-term investments with concentration levels. And these are all either guaranteed assets, for instance, certificates of deposit, up to $250,000, or United States Treasuries. We do have in there as well United States government-sponsored enterprises, which is at the very bottom of page 54, the bullet point. Those actually are not all government guaranteed. There's a lot of language going on right now in the legislature of what to do with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. We'll be following that closely. But right now it is basically, it's what we call, they don't have necessarily full faith and credit of the United States, but they're still in conservatorship from 2007 during the financial crisis. So your money's not at risk as it was prior to that date. If you go to page 55.
It's actually 56 in our packets, so that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No
Oh,
worries.
okay. So page 56, then under the, you have the certificates of deposit, obviously money market mutual funds, and then we've taken out the corporate debt. This really isn't something that is applicable to short-term money like this. Even with higher rated corporate debt, there is the possibility of default, so we completely eliminated that from the short-term assets. Bank deposit and checking accounts, at the bottom, and then page 57, we go into longer-term investments. All of the prior investments would be eligible for the longer-term investments. And longer-term investments would mean that $5 million reserve money and any of the clawback money that might be invested for a shorter time period. Again, the primary principles behind this would be liquidity, but adding a slight additional risk for greater yield potential by adding in their higher quality corporate bonds. And then there are quite a few factors listed here which kind of rein in what type of
Join the
investment
meeting.
can be done with this. So you can see it's all going to be investment grade, however, which means that it's higher quality as deemed by the rating agencies. However, 70% of it must be in the upper tier of the rating. So that's, we speak about diversification, so what you're really trying to do is minimize your risk. And using this type of investment vehicle, there's very, very little potential for default, but we do have to bring up the fact that it is a little bit slightly higher risk than just completely guaranteed assets. Going to page 58, this is where all of the, most of the redacted portion was added in here, speaking to what the board is, able to hire people like us and custodians to manage the assets. And it goes through, a couple of the things that we changed were, we wanted to make sure that there was at least an annual review that we would have with the audit committee, that we would supply at a minimum quarterly investment data, but that we would have at a minimum an annual review. And that's kind of it.
One thing that I received a question from a board member on, at the bottom of page 55, we list bank deposit and checking accounts twice, and there's some different definitions under each. So the first one is really just guaranteeing the FDIC coverage, which is to 1,000 and 100%. And this does include the current promontory interfinancial network insured cash sweep. And then the second is that we wouldn't place a limit on bank deposit or checking accounts as long as they're 100% guaranteed. If limits are expired or exceeded, the board would set limits in terms of essentially the economic and operating benefits to NHBA.
I think this was the last point that you and I had talked about. I thought what we had decided to do was to revert back to that original language saying no limit will be placed.
We did.
And so we would get rid of the sentence saying guaranteed by FDI insurance. I think if we use the second paragraph, adding on to it inclusive of promontory.
Okay.
Okay, so then,
So essentially you're saying we will merge these back together?
yes,
Okay.
yes. So we'd basically be taking out that one sentence, guaranteed by FDIC coverage.
Okay.
Currently set at 250,000. We would be using the initial language from the second bullet point. And then at the end of that, putting in the inclusive of promontory.
Okay. So we can merge that as a change. Other than that, I didn't receive any additional questions since the audit committee meeting where they recommended moving the policy forward.
Is there any discussion regarding this policy? Any questions, comments, concerns?